With constant innovation, access, and privacy concerns, as well as infrastructure and media regulation issues, powerful information and communication technologies face new policy challenges locally, nationally, and globally. The good news, this leaves a lot of opportunities for those who want to play a part in the process. Welcome to the School of Public Policy series, profiling professionals with careers in public policy. Today, we invite you to join the conversation as we speak with Josh Korn, Director of Global Innovation and Technology Public Policy for Netflix. Hi, I'm Whitney Sheridan, Director of Communications for the School of Public Policy at Penn State, along with Catherine Baumgardner. She's our Director of Professional Development and Student Engagement. Hi, Catherine.
Hi, Whitney. Great to be here today.
Good to have you. Our guest today is Penn State alumnus Josh Korn. In his current role at Netflix, Josh leads a team of policy experts in various technology policy fields. He's an expert on the intersection of technology and entertainment, including issues related to artificial intelligence, the protection of minors, net neutrality, and media law. Josh works to promote policies that support a competitive, open, and dynamic internet entertainment market. Prior to joining Netflix, Josh investigated anti-competitive conduct and mergers as part of the Telecommunications and Media Enforcement section of the U.S. Department of Justice Antitrust Division. Josh, thanks so much for being here today.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited.
We're excited to have you and to sort of welcome you back to Penn State here via Zoom.
Hopefully we'll be there in person sometime soon.
Yes. So first I want to start off, I want to remind our guests that this is a conversation for you to ask Josh your questions. So at any point throughout the conversation, please do not hesitate to use the Q&A or the chat window. We're going to keep reminding you throughout the conversation. But to get us started, Josh, what put you on your path to pursue a career in policy? I know, this wasn't your original goal as a Penn State student. So tell us a little bit what got you into communications policy.
Yeah, so I went to Penn State wanting to be a 60 Minutes producer. And when I got here, I started interning at WPSU, the radio station, and I decided I wanted to be a This American Life producer. And so I had my own fake This American Life show that was really terrible. Don't Google it. Learn through that process that, it wasn't necessarily making the stories for air that I liked, but it was the writing of the stories and the telling of the stories and the coming up with the stories that I really enjoyed. And so I positioned or transitioned to become a sociology and a history major. And so two liberal arts fields that are really focused on telling stories and communicating stories about the past and about people and about society, and loved it and really enjoyed it, but wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do until I went on a Penn State trip to DC. And it was a communications policy trip. It was just kind of random, but I was always interested in the media from the radio days and from the TV days. And on this trip, it was right around the time that Comcast was buying NBC Universal. So you had a big cable company purchasing a big movie producer. And so we got to talk to all these people about this merger at the Federal Communications Commission, in Congress, in the public interest, and got to discuss and debate and probably was more obnoxious than I realized in debating some of these people, and decided I really liked this kind of notion of figuring out what is in the public interest, what is the right thing for regulators to do when they have control of a merger or two companies coming together. And so that kind of kickstarted my interest in this space, and have been kind of playing in that field ever since.
Josh, it sounds like you've used your Penn State student experience, and you had some aha moments along the way that have led you on a really interesting career journey. I'd love to have you tell us a little bit about that early career journey, prior to Netflix, and kind of what led you down the path that you ultimately took.
Yeah, it was somewhat linear too, in that we were talking about this merger when we were in DC, where Comcast was buying NBCU, and so I started applying for jobs all over DC, kind of in the policy space, just trying to get anything. And I found this job at the Department of Justice Antitrust Division, and I walked into that interview and talked about this trip and how interested I was in communications policy and the impact of competition in the communication space. And so they took that excitement and that passion and they put me in the healthcare section looking at healthcare mergers, and I hated it. I was so miserable. And it's funny looking back, and when you think about how important healthcare is and how important media is, and media is important, but healthcare seems maybe a little bit more. But I finally convinced someone to move me into the media and communications section of the Department of Justice Antitrust Division, and actually got to work on that Comcast NBCU case years later when they were reviewing kind of how their decision played out in reality. So it was a good circle. And while I was there, I got introduced to someone who I actually had met on that first DC trip with Penn State, who happened to work at Netflix. And that was a good kind of segue into a relationship. She didn't remember me, but I said, "Do you remember my class?" And she said, "Oh, vaguely, I remember some Penn State class coming to talk to me." But it was a great intro. And then months later, when there was a job at Netflix, I was able to reach out to that person and say, "Hey, remember me, who was the person who reminded you of that time I met you that one other time?" And that relationship stems back to this kind of random trip that I took through Penn State. And so it's kind of a funny path, but it proves the benefit of relationships and how important they are as you try and navigate your way through, at least for me, through the early parts of a career.
So really no degrees of separation when it comes down to it. You find
no, it was it was lucky in that sense. But I always tell people as they're thinking about how to navigate their career is, people, there are so many people who are applying for jobs, and it's really hard. And I sympathize with everyone who's doing it, because it's a grind, and you just have to keep putting in that effort. But essentially, like, someone is looking for someone with that really specific, unique skill that they're looking for. And I happen to have a unique skill kind of coming to Netflix, in that I knew a lot about this communications industry in a way that was really deep from that experience at the Department of Justice, and kind of understood the industry in a way. And that was a specific type of knowledge that Netflix was looking for. And so it worked out in that way. And so, no matter where you are and what you're doing, figuring out what am I learning that's unique? What am I doing that's unique that someone might be looking for? And even when you're out of school, even some of that research experience and that writing experience, that might be what someone's really looking for in terms of the skills that they specifically need.
So some wonderful insights there in how you navigate a career, even at a very young age. And especially when you're entering the field, and even as you're moving through the field, it's really knowing who you are and knowing what you want. And that takes a lot of courage.
And I think being aware of what someone else might want from you. What value do you add to an organization? How do you contribute to their mission, to their goals, in a way that other people can't? And that's storytelling to some extent, and looking for those points that are unique and compelling. And now I do advocacy, and I'm talking to people, telling them stories about our business and about the industry, and figuring out the ways to make that compelling. And so it's all kind of related, and being a really good writer and being a good storyteller is really important in getting people to listen.
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to make sure we encourage our attendees to ask questions for Josh. Don't be shy. Don't hesitate to use the Q&A or the chat window at any point throughout the discussion. But that's a great segue, Josh. Tell us about your current role at Netflix and the day-to-day responsibilities of your job.
Sure. So there's a bunch of elements to doing the work of public policy, and that is everything from figuring out the politics of public policy to developing the research, to communicating that research really well, and then also just really understanding the policy itself. How do industries, societies interact with public policy? And so at Netflix, I work on a team of policy specialists, and I lead a team of tech policy specialists. And so we are specializing in different public policy fields so that we can be experts for lots of other folks on our team and for policymakers around the world, and share our views about how industries work, how Netflix interacts with society, with entertainment, with technology, and be able to communicate that to whoever we're trying to explain and tell our story to.
And you were talking about advocacy earlier, and you're talking about being a storyteller. Tell us a little bit more about what policy advocacy looks like at a company like Netflix. We have a question here from someone in the audience.
Sure. So, I always say, the public policy is about the pursuit of the public interest, right? What is the best for society? And if you're a policymaker, that's a really hard job. It is all about weighing the different interests to try and get down to the bottom of what the right answer is, and how do you prioritize the different elements of kind of social good that you want to promote. And so from an advocacy perspective, I think a lot about how to educate about our business. How do we tell people the story of what we do, and connect that to that public interest that someone is looking to promote? How is, things that help Netflix, for example, compete on an open internet, compete against other content providers freely, just on the basis of content and price and the service, as opposed to other influences, for example, and being able to tell that story from the perspective of both Netflix, but also the perspective of the broader industry that we're operating in, and the broader economy and society that we're all kind of existing in.
How do you balance those interests? Because you're talking about the public good, and you have to balance the interests of Netflix as well. I mean, there's a lot of juggling that you have to do here, especially when you're trying to tell these stories and advocate. Like, how do you handle that?
And that's why being a policymaker is really hard, because you have lots of people who are telling you things, and why what they're saying is the right thing for the public interest. And for me and my approach, it's all about being really honest and transparent, explaining exactly what it is that we do, how we operate, and why it is that we operate in a certain way. What incentivizes us to behave in a new way. So take, for example, Netflix is buying content from all over the world. Why do we do that? We do that because people have never seen content from all over the world. And so there's real advantage to that diversity, to telling those new stories. It's a differentiator. And so while that is good for our business, it also has some societal benefit that people are exposed to new stories. People are seeing themselves on screen. And a lot of that is just the way our business operates is really designed to promote that kind of diversification of storytelling.
I want to get back to that because I know you have a lot of work globally, and I want to talk a little bit more about that. But one of our MPP students is asking a question. Nicole Heitzenrader is asking, what challenges has the pandemic brought to your job and to Netflix in general?
Yeah, so to the job is it's similar to many jobs where we're all sitting behind a computer screen, which means you can't go talk to someone in person and build a relationship. It's very almost transactional the way you have meetings online, and so that's been a real challenge for me, who just likes people and likes being around people and likes talking to people, and so that's been a real limiter, but it's also a big equalizer in that people have kind of an equal ability to reach people. You don't have any benefit from being in one place over another. You can connect live from wherever you're from, and so there's a balance there that we could get into. But in terms of for the business, Netflix has been pretty lucky in a stay-at-home environment where people are looking to be entertained at home and being an online streaming service. But with that, there are lots of industries that have been hurting, and so trying to make sure we're doing our part to support the production ecosystem has been something we've spent a lot of time doing. In my role specifically, you've seen a lot more internet usage, and so how is Netflix contributing to the internet? And so we do a lot to help make delivering movies and TV shows more efficient. For example, by rather than sending a movie to someone in Amsterdam via a really long cable from California, maybe we can put a copy of that movie in Amsterdam. And so using less of those resources so that the type of content that does have to go over that long connection, say a video conference that is live, there's more space, there's more capacity for that video to kind of flow over that really long cable. And so talking a lot about kind of what it is that we can do and are doing to try and support a really robust, efficient internet ecosystem.
Great. And I want to ask you about some of those challenges in when you're dealing with the markets in other countries, like what you're talking about, dealing with Amsterdam. But we do have another question from the audience, which I want to keep encouraging. What are the—
Please keep asking questions, everybody.
Yeah, I know. We really want our audience to ask questions because that's why you're here. What are the skills you consider essential to succeed in tech policy, whether in government or industry? And how do you navigate the policy and regulatory space successfully? Great question.
Really big question. So in skills that I think are really important, I think as I said, transparency and honesty is really important. You want to be someone that people can trust because you're telling them the truth and you're being open, even when sometimes it's not supportive of your argument. And so I take that very seriously, is maintaining that level of integrity, but also just communicating effectively, is learning to write really well, communicate verbally really well. And I think that's, as a school of public policy, as a broader liberal arts school, that ability to write and research and synthesize information into kind of something that's concrete and clear, that skill is so important and is so valuable, and people really look to that. And so, not something to be underestimated.
So we're getting some more questions that have one that I want to kick off here. How do you deal with a lot of markets, which we were just talking about, nationally and globally? How do you manage these distinct policies and regulations? And that leads to this audience question I want to get to. So first, if you could talk about how you deal with all these policies and regulations and juggling them all.
Sure. I mean, part of being a global company is operating in a whole bunch of countries with sovereign law, and really what that means is their own public interest objectives, their own value system that might be different from place to place. And from a public policy advocacy perspective, trying to instill your own public interest values from where you came from isn't going to be really successful when trying to explain yourself. And so I think one of the hardest things to do is to try and really understand what leads policymakers to make decisions, what leads to certain public interest objectives, the history behind that, and then what current events are resulting in shifts to what is viewed as the public interest. And so, take media policy, for example. You have the US with 300 million people or more. And so we have this really robust media ecosystem that's really self-sustaining. And as a result, our media policy has been shaped in a very specific way. But if you have a country that's smaller, it's harder to kind of invest in and monetize content. And so you have a whole different policy consideration there of, how do I preserve my culture? How do I ensure that this industry can be successful? Which from a US perspective, the notion of the government getting involved in content is pretty limited. But in other parts of the world, that's a really important consideration. And so one of kind of my first big tasks as a public policy person working outside the US was trying to understand and empathize with that public interest objective that you're seeing. And so there's a lot of kind of trying to get beyond yourself and your own understanding to really understand and appreciate what it is that drives governments to do what they do.
Now, does your work also involve modifying the technology and the platform to comply with the different regulations as well? Because we have a question here about modifying the Netflix platform to comply with the GDPR in the EU. So do you deal with that kind of regulation as well?
So we have a whole team of regulatory lawyers that looks at laws that exist and make sure that we're compliant. But part of my job as a public policy person is to help explain why it is we, before a law is made, why it is we do the things we do. Because it's hard to know if you're a policymaker working on a whole bunch of issues. You're working on, healthcare policy, you're working on agricultural policy, you're working on trade policy, you're working on transportation policy, and then media policy is just one aspect of that, or tech policy is just one aspect of that. It's hard to be an expert in that. And so part of, again, that job of being, transparent and a helpful aid in helping to explain, hey, here's why we do what we do, and here's how that fits within what you're trying to achieve. And maybe sometimes what you're trying to do won't actually happen because of what you're proposing, or sometimes there are some unintended consequences of what you're proposing, and here's how that might impact us and our ability to do certain things. And so there is a lot of kind of thinking through, all right, when a policy proposal is made, what are the implications for Netflix, for the industry, for society at large, for those broader public interest objectives, understand those, internalize those, and then communicate back out what that actually means.
So Josh, you've talked about a lot of the externally facing challenges of what you do, and you've mentioned throughout this word of team. So talk to us a little bit about how you keep your internal team aligned around what you need to do? What are some of the skills that you employ to help them to be successful, which ultimately helps you on the external side?
Yeah, so we're a big public policy team with people around the world working on different things who are experts in different things. And one thing that I do love about Netflix is we're working with some of the smartest people you've ever met in your life. And so having the confidence in your colleagues that they really know what they're talking about, are experts in their field, and are looking out for the best interests of Netflix at all times. That sort of level of trust, I think, is probably the most important thing. And COVID has been hard for everyone because I think you build trust by seeing people in person and spending time with them. And so we're all depleting those tanks. Luckily, we've spent a lot of time being intentional about how to refill those tanks, even from afar. But yeah, building that trust with folks, and then within my team, focus. One thing we try and focus a lot at Netflix is how do I provide the context for folks to make good decisions, as opposed to just trying to make all the decisions myself, or where I probably don't have the context or the time to think about it. How do you provide that context so that others can make really good decisions, and then trusting them that they are the right people to make the right decisions, and again have a really good motivation and incentive for the success of Netflix.
I want to remind our guests that the chat is open and we're asking for your questions for Josh Korn. So don't be shy. He's here to answer your questions. So Josh, you're talking about a big team of policy experts. You handle a lot of policy issues. Talk to us about the major issues that are at the top of your mind right now and on your agenda.
Sure. Well,
that's probably a lot, right?
There's a couple. One thing that's always top of mind is protecting minors, and helping parents have the tools to set Netflix for their families and for their kids. We're a subscription service, and so there's so much that is in control, or that parents are able to control about their experience. And so how do we make sure that that's being communicated well, and that policymakers understand that objective and that goal of ours, to really give parents all sorts of control, and that it's a service for adults, and so they can cancel at any time, and so our goal is to give them that control. I also spend a lot of time thinking about how do we scale the internet? How does that work? How do we facilitate and continue to have really great, robust competition on the internet? And you see that with lots of great companies coming in, offering streaming services and creating content, and that really benefits consumers. And for Netflix, that means we have to compete harder. That means we have to make better content, that our technology has to be better. But that ultimately makes us all better, and that competition is really good. And so, focusing a lot on how we do that, and make sure that nothing is limiting that ability for us to kind of all compete against each other on the basis of content.
And you're also a board member, talking about privacy issues, a board member of the Family Online Safety Institute. I wanted to mention that as well. And that's something that's important to you, right?
Yeah, so that's an organization with a number of companies that's really focused on, again, giving parents the information. And so it's one vehicle that we can make sure that information gets out to parents so that they can, make good decisions, and have the tools to control the Netflix experience in the way that they want for their families. And so it's a group of companies that share ideas, that works together to make sure lots of parental control information is readily available, and we're meeting parents where they are. So that's a great organization to be a part of.
And it sounds like that organization also is a strong advocacy organization. And so I'm just wondering what advice you might give for students who are interested in doing more about policy advocacy in their roles. So you've shown how your company is focused on it, and you're now providing that expertise. But how might students do that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, becoming experts and thinking about, and it doesn't mean you have to stay an expert in one thing specifically, but what can I build some expertise on that allows me to really become a trusted advisor to a policymaker, to share information in a way that is clear and transparent and helpful, so that policymakers have a better sense of the different interests and the different realities of industries. And so, that's one of the greatest things about Penn State is it's so big. It has so many different departments. It has so many amazing expert professors. It has so many opportunities. And so, find the different things that you might be interested in and learn about them, because, public policy is very specific to whatever that public interest objective is that you're trying to achieve. And so the work of public policy, the work of driving towards the public interest requires really getting into the nitty-gritty of how does the system work. Imagine trying to do healthcare policy without understanding how insurance works and how hospitals operate, without understanding how research into pharmaceuticals works. That's a really complicated space. And so to do health policy, trying to learn as much as you possibly can about the different facets of the industry and the different perspectives, the different people who are advocating for the different positions, why they're advocating for that way, so that you can then, kind of weigh and find the balance, and again, support that public interest objective.
We have a question here from one of our students I want to ask, and it's a great one. What kind of trends have you seen in regards to the job outlook in public policy?
Well, I think in tech policy specifically, I think you're seeing a lot of attention on it. The internet has grown in importance and in influence, and more of our lives were facilitated by services or companies, and so there's a lot of people paying attention to that and to paying attention to technology. And so you're definitely seeing a trend of more people interested and trying to figure out, again, what is, the right outcome. This isn't a problem for Netflix, as we're not a social media platform, but if you think about the challenge of misinformation and how to solve that. I mean, that's a really big, tough challenge, and we need all the more people who are really smart thinking about how to deal with them in a way that is balancing expression, balancing individual rights, but also being realistic about some of the harms that we're seeing, and how you address those challenges, or those are big challenges. I'm not so sure.
That's great. And I'm very excited to see some more questions coming in from our students. We want to encourage those questions to continue. Here's another one. What skills would you recommend one focus on for individuals pursuing a career in tech policy?
Again, take advantage of the IT school. It's one of the best IT schools in the country, and I'm sure there are tons of speakers who are constantly coming in talking about the different considerations, both from a technological standpoint, what's new, what's coming, what's evolving, how does it work, to the ethics of it all, and how are people dealing with some of the challenges that technologists are facing. And so, take advantage of every opportunity you have at Penn State to learn from those experts who are just, just right there and available to you, because that is something that's like truly unique. And then, get involved in it to the extent you can. Again, public policy and figuring out the public interest is a nuanced question. And so the more you can understand, the more expert you are, the better. And so, try and understand a little bit of code, understand how an algorithm works. What really is artificial intelligence? Like what a complicated name for a big long equation. And how does that work?
So I wanted to ask you about that. You've talked about storytelling and the need to make sure that we're getting the word out about these policy issues. And given the technical nature of your area of policy that you cover, what strategies do you employ in communicating the legal and policy issues that you could pass on to our students? You've talked a little bit about this, but maybe tell us a little bit more.
Yeah, it can be really challenging sometimes, because some of these issues are really complicated. And I think one piece of advice I can give is, like, don't underestimate going back to the basics, going back to the beginning. Even when talking about Netflix, I often remind people that we don't have any advertising on Netflix. It's a subscription service that people pay for example. And so when we're recommending content to you, really the only thing we're doing is trying to help you find something to watch. There's no other interest there. Our goal is helping you find something that you enjoy. And so, but that seems obvious, right? Everyone, lots of people use Netflix. People know what it is, but not being afraid to go back to that beginning, talking about how the internet works. Go back to remind people that the internet is a bunch of cables. And when we're talking about delivering content, we're literally talking about it traveling under the ocean. And so when content is traveling under the ocean, that's a pipe in the ground, that's a pipe in the water that has to be maintained. And so that's a really scarce, precious resource. So if you can move content from not having to go over that pipe, that's really valuable. And you start to kind of paint a picture, tell a story when you take a step back, as opposed to assuming that people have some of that context and that background. And so I always try and start one step further back. And even when people are explaining things to me, I appreciate it when they remind me some of the basics, because I'm not having to remember and keep up and figure it out. They're helping paint that picture and tell that story. And I mean, if you think of kind of a novel, you could just say a small town and you could picture a small town, but when you're reading something, they usually an author will paint a picture, so you really have this sense of the landscape and sense of the scene around you, and try and paint that picture.
That's a great point. Yeah.
So as you're painting that picture and you're thinking about the people that are impacted by the decisions that you make, how do you navigate the external pressures? You have people who have political political pressures. You've got legal, regulatory, government. How do you navigate that minefield? How do you manage that?
It's just about observing and being realistic about it. Sometimes you might not be convincing, and being aware of that. Sometimes there are other public interests that trump your own kind of view of what is the most important public interest, and being open to that reality. And if you're closed off to that, and you're only kind of coming at it with your own worldview and your own what's in your interest, as opposed to trying to really get to understand what is that policymaker's public interest, or interests, you're less likely to be successful in whatever the best outcome is that you could possibly hope for. But we exist in the reality of politics, and so trying to ignore that isn't always very helpful, even though from a pure public policy perspective, you might want to ignore that. But in a democracy, it is the will of the people, and that's why politics do matter and are important, because it truly is kind of this the how the view of the people is proliferated into defining what those public interests are.
We have a question coming in. Since Netflix is such a world-class company, do they recruit more from the Ivies, state schools, or a mixture? And what do you think you uniquely learned at Penn State to make you effective in your role?
So, there's no one place that we're looking at talent from. I think one of the most important things when you're looking for great people is, diversity of perspective, and, you want people to challenge you and be open to challenging you, and finding all that information. And then what was the second half of that question? Sorry.
The second half was, do you think you uniquely learned at Penn State to make you effective in your role?
I think it was, really the ability to get interested in lots of different things and to dive deep in them. My favorite part of Penn State was, you never really had to take a gen ed that you didn't want to take, because there was some gen ed that was at least somewhat interesting. I remember, I am not a science guy, and I remember I really like history, and so I remember for my science gen ed, I took the history of rubber, and how rubber changed the world. And so, maybe not my first choice of topics to study, but it was at least interesting and related to me. And so, the ability to see all those different options out there, and pick and choose and dive deep on them, and learn about them in a really open way, I think would be really helpful as you're trying to become a policy expert. You have to be open and curious, and flexible to changing dynamics, and really kind of delve deep into that. And so, that ability to, or desire for, learning about new things, I think is something that is unique to a Penn State education, just based on the breadth of information and content that you can access.
And one of our students has another question here. Do you have a clear picture of your own future career goals in public policy?
I'm just having fun. I don't, and I try not to think too hard about that. I try and just really learn a lot about everything that I can, and that's one of the fun things, is there's so many different facets of Netflix that I'm able to learn about, things like how recommendation systems work, and how internet networks work, and privacy considerations. And so hopefully in the future that will continue to help me be successful, but I'm also cognizant, hopefully I'll have a long time, there's a long runway there to figure out what's next. But right now it's really, for me, just continuing to try and grasp as much of that information as I can.
So Josh, your journey has taken you through governmental and the private sector. Perhaps you could give our students and audience, maybe our recent grads as well, and really those working currently, some advice on how you navigate or how you compare different workplaces and different cultures to help you to find the right fit for where you are at the point in your life that you are.
Yeah, I mean, the most interesting part about working for the government is that ambiguity, in terms of you're hearing lots of reasons why one thing is better than the other. You should lean in one direction, and this is the right public policy outcome to achieve this broader public interest, and this public interest aspect is weighted more than this other public interest aspect, and you have to figure out what the right answer is for everyone. And that's a really hard job, and a really important job, and there's so much weighing on you, and so that is, I think, from working for the government, figuring that out. Take a merger for example. Are these two firms competing against each other, and are they driving each other to be better, and is that competition good? Or is there enough competition in the market that the merger of those two firms won't result in a material diminishing of that competition, but they'll have better ability to invest and compete harder against all the other people. And trying to get to the bottom of that is fact finding, is asking people, is looking at the different aspects of that industry and trying to really understand who competes with whom and who's innovating and how does that all work together. And so it's really fun, but it's really hard. And then on the private side, it's about just really telling your story and being clear and transparent about how your business works, why it works the way it does, which is and how that aligns with what that policymaker's public interest objectives are. And that's a different role, but I say it's sometimes a little bit easier than having to weigh all those different options and figure out the right course.
Josh, you've had a few different roles at Netflix that I want to ask you about, but I want to remind our audience that we have a few minutes left for questions. If you want to sneak some in, now would be a great time. Talk to us a little bit about how those roles have differed from where you are now.
So yeah, I've had a lot of opportunity to do different things. So for example, I was leading public policy for Australia and New Zealand for a little while. And that was really fun because it was not only learning what the policy issues are in Australia or in New Zealand, but learning why those policy issues are important, learning how that specific industry in those specific countries is important, figuring out, who are the different actors and players in that industry, and why are they saying what they're saying. And so that was really fun in trying to be as aware of the local nuance and local realities as possible, while still kind of understanding that, hey, to some extent I am an outsider, and I'm observing. And so asking questions of people who do live there and who live and breathe all of that was really fun and really interesting work. And so that was, a lot of day-to-day kind of doing everything. Now our team's a little bit bigger and I'm really just focusing on those tech policy issues, but I'm able to compare and contrast them across different countries around the world. How is one country dealing with something and versus how another country is dealing with something? And is there a lesson that you can kind of share about how something worked or didn't work? Or does it allow you to be more creative in giving policymakers ideas that they might not have thought about because you saw it in some other country? And so that kind of global comparative policy is something that I personally really love, because you get this bird's eye view and are able to see how it's all implemented in different ways.
I want to wrap up with a final question and give our audience a few more minutes just in case they have some last minute questions. But what advice would you give a student looking to follow a career path similar to yours? And what do you wish you knew as a student when you were here at Penn State?
So I wish I did more things while I was at Penn State. I wish I took advantage, and that's why I was so strong about going to the IT school and listening to the guest speakers, because I think I did that once in 4 years. And I there has to be dozens of people speaking every year, and I missed that. And man, what a mistake that was. And so that's my advice for taking advantage of where you are and the amazing opportunities, and figure out those trips and those professors who are, going on an expedition or going to DC or going to Harrisburg or, looking at I think I did one trip where we were looking at different types of farming, and we went to an industrial farm and an organic farm, and just try to get as much experience and exposure as you can, because there's so much there. And then when you're out, trying to build a career and find that role, be open. My one piece of kind of job application advice that someone gave me once, it sounds so obvious, but I think we, or at least I'm always guilty of it, is don't say no to a job you don't have. We kind of psych ourselves out of like, well, I'm not going to interview it. I'm not, I don't have what they're looking for, or maybe I don't want to do that. But go and try and see what happens and have the conversations, and and then you can always say no in the end. But put yourselves out there to all those different possible venues. There's so many ways to get involved in policy, whether it's a specific issue area and the public interest groups, the companies that are involved in that industry, the regulatory agencies that are focused in that industry, or it's the different forms of governance. There's, am I interested in the legislative process and how laws and are made more generally, or how enforcement is done of those laws. And so there's so many different paths, and just be open to the different avenues of getting involved, because that will give you your best shot, and ultimately give you that unique thing that will help you transition to the next place.
Great advice. Well, I want to thank our guest, Josh Korn, Director of Global Innovation and Technology Public Policy for Netflix. And thank you all for your questions. We hope you'll join us for the next conversation in the Policy Profile series, Wednesday, October 13th at 3 o'clock, with guest Christian Sora. He's the Executive Vice President of the South Carolina Hospital Association. He'll be talking about his experience in health policy and about his work as Deputy Chief of Staff for former Governor of South Carolina, Nikki Haley. Learn more about events from the School of Public Policy on our website, publicpolicy.psu.edu. Hi, I'm Whitney Sheridan, and with Catherine Baumgardner for all of us at the School of Public Policy. Thanks for watching. And Josh, thank you again so much for being here. We really appreciate you spending the afternoon with us.
Thank you, Josh.
Thanks for the great questions, everyone.